A 75-year-old woman gave away her house, her savings, and 15 years of her life to a family that threw her out on a Friday morning with a suitcase and a cardboard box. The neighbors saw nothing. The son was already dead, and the daughter-in-law who locked the door behind her had already forgotten her name by lunchtime. But what no one in that quiet suburb knew, what the daughter-in-law certainly never bothered to imagine, was that the old woman would end up standing in the Arizona dust beside a rusted school bus that hadn't moved in 15 years. And that inside that bus, hidden in a place only love would think to look, was something that would change everything. Before we go any further, if you believe that no one deserves to be discarded, that the people who raised us and loved us and gave us everything deserve more than a locked door and a shrug, then join this community. Subscribe to the channel. We tell stories here about people who refuse to disappear. And Midge Hollander's story is one you will carry with you long after it ends. Marjorie Hollander had not been called Marjorie in 40 years. She was Midge. Had been Midge since the first day of her teaching career at Roosevelt Elementary in Flagstaff, when a 6-year-old boy with a gap in his front teeth looked up at her and said her name was too long, and could he just call her Midge instead? She had laughed and said yes, and the name had stuck to her like a second skin worn smooth by decades of use until it felt more real than the one on her birth certificate. Walter had called her Midge. Clement had called her Midge. Even Jolene in the early years had called her Midge back when Jolene still smiled at her like she meant it. Now Midge stood on the sidewalk outside the house on Briarwood Lane with a suitcase that had a broken wheel and a cardboard box that was already softening at the corners from the weight of the photo albums inside. The April sun was warm on her shoulders. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler was running that rhythmic tsk-tsk of water hitting concrete. It was 9:15 in the morning. She knew the time because she had looked at her watch when the front door closed, some instinct telling her she should remember the exact moment her life divided into before and after. The house behind her was a 4-bedroom colonial with a stone walkway and a Japanese maple in the front yard. She had paid for it. Not helped with the down payment, not contributed to the mortgage, not chipped in. She had sold her own home, the small ranch house on Cedar Hill Drive, where she and Walter had raised Clement, where Walter had rebuilt the engine of a 1968 Mustang in the garage, where she had graded 30 years of 7th-grade essays at the kitchen table with a red pen and a cup of tea that always went cold before she finished. She had sold that house for $180,000 and given every cent to Clement and Jolene for their down payment. Not a loan, a gift, because that is what mothers do, or at least what Midge believed mothers do, which was to give without keeping score, to hand over the thing you loved, because the person you loved needed it more. She had been 67 when she moved into their spare bedroom. Temporary, she told herself, just until she found a small apartment. But the months piled up the way months do when you are old and tired and afraid of being alone, and somehow 8 years passed, and she never left. She made herself useful. She cooked Clement's favorite pot roast on Sundays. She kept the bathrooms clean. She learned to fold Jolene's blouses the way Jolene liked them, with the sleeves tucked in and the collar flat. She learned to stay out of the living room when Jolene had friends over. She learned to eat quickly and wash her dishes immediately, so there was no evidence she had used the kitchen. She learned, in other words, to take up as little space as possible, to make herself small enough that Jolene could almost forget she was there. It mostly worked. Jolene's impatience surfaced in small ways. A sigh when Midge came downstairs in the morning. A pointed comment about the electricity bill. A look not hostile exactly, but measuring the way you look at a piece of furniture you're not sure belongs in the room anymore. Clement smoothed things over. He had Walter's gift for that, for standing in the doorway between two people and making each of them feel heard. His voice would go low and steady, the same register he used when he coached Little League, and he would put his hand on Midge's shoulder and say something simple. "Your family, Mom. This is your home too." Then Clement died. He was 43 years old. He was sitting at his desk at the insurance office on a Wednesday afternoon in October, and a blood vessel in his brain that had been quietly thinning for years. The way a rope frays one strand at a time until there is nothing left to hold finally gave way. The aneurysm was massive. By the time his coworker noticed, he had slumped forward onto his keyboard. By the time the ambulance arrived, by the time anyone thought to call, Midge Clement was gone. She had already buried her husband. Burying a child was different. When Walter died, the grief had been enormous but comprehensible. He was 60. His heart had been bad for years. She had time to prepare, time to imagine life without him, time to begin the long work of learning to sleep alone. But Clement was young. Clement was healthy. Clement was supposed to outlive her by 30 years and put flowers on her grave and tell his children stories about their grandmother, who used to read them books in funny voices and always kept butterscotch candies in her purse. The wrong person died. That was the thought she could not stop thinking in the weeks after the funeral. The wrong person died, and nothing in the universe would ever make sense again. She moved through the house on Briarwood Lane like something translucent. She cooked meals nobody ate. She cleaned rooms nobody entered. She sat on the edge of her bed at night and listened to the silence where Clement's voice used to be. And the silence was so large, it had texture, it had weight. It pressed against her chest like a hand. The first year after Clement's death, Jolene tolerated Midge's presence the way you tolerate a slow leak in the basement. She was too busy with her own grief, too occupied with the mechanics of widowhood at 36, to bother with Midge. They barely spoke. They coexisted in the house like two people in a waiting room, who know they have nothing to say to each other, but cannot leave. Then the second year came, and Jolene began to change. She started coming home later. She bought new clothes. She started talking about moving forward, about next chapters, about the rest of her life. And when she said these things, she looked past Midge as though Midge were a wall she was planning to knock down during the renovation. Nolan Petrie appeared on a Thursday evening. Jolene brought him through the front door with the careful presentation of someone displaying a purchase. Midge was in the kitchen washing lettuce, and Jolene's voice carried that bright, lacquered quality it took on when she wanted to sound happier than she was. "Midge, this is Nolan. We've been seeing each other. He's wonderful." Nolan was 35. He wore his hair slicked back and his confidence like a borrowed coat, slightly too large, slightly too deliberate. He shook Midge's hand without looking at her face. His eyes traveled the room, instead appraising the countertops, the fixtures, the square footage. Midge recognized that look. She had seen it on the faces of the real estate agents who came to evaluate Walter's house before she sold it. It was the look of someone calculating what things are worth. Over the next 3 weeks, Nolan became permanent. He left his jacket on the couch. He changed the television channel without asking. He made comments about the guest bathroom being outdated and the neighborhood being in transition. Transition, being a word Midge had learned, usually meant someone was about to be displaced. Then came the Sunday morning. Midge was at the stove scrambling eggs. She heard them come down the stairs together. Jolene and Nolan, their footsteps synchronized in that way that meant they had discussed something in bed and reached a decision before their feet hit the floor. Jolene sat down at the kitchen table. The kitchen table Midge had bought with money from her house. Nolan stood behind Jolene with his arms crossed, and the arrangement of their bodies told Midge everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. Jolene's face wore an expression Midge had learned to read over 8 years. The one that meant a decision had been made and input was not being solicited. "Midge, we need to talk. Nolan and I are getting married. We're going to need the spare bedroom for a nursery." The words arrived in order, each one landing like a small, precise blow. Midge turned off the stove. She did not sit down. "Congratulations," she said, and the word tasted like metal in her mouth. "We need you out by Friday." Jolene continued, and her voice was no longer bright. It was flat and efficient. The voice of someone completing an administrative task. "I think we've been more than patient. You've lived here rent-free for 8 years. Clement would have wanted you to be independent." The cruelty of that sentence. The specific surgical cruelty of using a dead man's name to justify abandoning his mother. Midge felt something inside her chest tighten, and then release the way a guitar string snaps when you turn the peg 1/4 turn too far. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying in front of Jolene was like bleeding in front of someone who found blood inconvenient. Jolene, I gave you the money for this house. I sold my home, everything I had, and we're grateful for that loan. Jolene interrupted. It wasn't a loan. Well, Clement's gone. Jolene's voice did not waver. And Nolan and I need to move forward. I'm sure you understand. Nolan spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who has practiced sounding reasonable. We've already arranged a moving service. They'll come Friday to help transport your things. Transport them where, Midge asked, and her voice was quiet. But there was something underneath it now. Something she could feel rising from a place so deep she had forgotten it existed. I don't have anywhere to go. Jolene shrugged. That's not really our problem. You're a grown woman. Maybe contact social services or look into senior housing. Midge looked at her daughter-in-law. This woman she had welcomed into her family like a daughter. This woman for whom she had sold her home, cooked 1,000 meals, folded 1,000 blouses with the sleeves tucked in just so. This woman, who was now sitting at the table Midge had paid for in the house Midge had financed, telling Midge she had 4 days to disappear. She did not shout. She did not beg. She looked at Jolene and said something she had been holding for a long time, the words arriving fully formed, as though they had been waiting for this exact moment to exist. I hope someday you understand what it means to need someone who isn't there. Jolene blinked. Nolan shifted his weight. Neither of them responded, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound Midge had ever heard. The next 4 days passed in a kind of fog. Midge packed what little she owned into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box. One suitcase held clothes, the other held practical items, her medications, her reading glasses, a bar of soap, a small flashlight she kept in her nightstand. The cardboard box held the only things that mattered: photo albums. Clement at 6 months, at 2 years, at 5, at 10. Clement in his Little League uniform. Clement at his wedding. His arm around Jolene, his face so full of joy it hurt to look at. Walter in the garage, with grease on his hands, and that grin he wore when an engine finally turned over. Walter and Midge on their wedding day 1970. Her dress borrowed his suit too short in the sleeves. Both of them squinting into the sun and laughing at something the photographer had said. She called the senior services number Jolene had suggested. The wait list for affordable housing was 11 months. She had no savings. Her social security check was $1,400 a month. First and last month's rent anywhere within 50 miles would eat through 6 months of that. On Friday morning, Midge stood in the foyer with her suitcase and her box. Jolene came downstairs, dressed for work, car keys already in her hand. Do you have somewhere to go? She asked the question, delivered with the same inflection a hotel receptionist uses when confirming checkout. Midge considered lying. She considered inventing a friend, a cousin, a church program. But she was 75 years old, and she was tired of performing for people who did not care whether the performance was convincing. No. Well, good luck. Jolene held the front door open. Midge picked up her suitcase and her box. She walked toward the door and stopped beside Jolene close enough to see the small crease between Jolene's eyebrows, the only evidence that anything resembling discomfort existed beneath the surface. I loved your husband more than my own life, Midge said. Jolene's voice softened for exactly 1 second, a crack in the wall she had spent 2 years building. I know you did, but he's gone, Midge. And I have to think about my future. Midge stepped through the door and onto the front step. The sprinkler across the street was still running. The Japanese maple was leafing out in that pale green that happens only in early spring, the color of things just beginning. She heard the door close behind her. She heard the deadbolt turn, and she stood on the sidewalk with everything she owned, and nowhere in the world to go. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the mail carrier to pass and look at her curiously, long enough for a neighbor to pull out of a driveway and not wave, long enough for the shadow of the Japanese maple to shift 2 inches across the concrete. Then something happened that Midge would later describe as Walter's voice, though she knew it was her own. It came from the same place the words to Jolene had come from, that deep underground room where the things you have forgotten are not gone but only waiting. And what it said was this: the land, the bus. Walter had left her the house on Cedar Hill Drive, the small insurance policy, and one other thing she had not thought about in years: a piece of land. 5 acres of scrub desert 40 miles outside Prescott, near a place that barely qualified as a town, Copper Hill. Population 300 and something. The land had been in Walter's family since his uncle homesteaded it in the 1930s. Walter and Midge had driven out to see it once decades ago on a Sunday afternoon, when Clement was small. There was nothing on it but dust and juniper, and one old school bus Walter had towed there when the county retired it from the fleet. Bus number 47, a 1972 Bluebird. Walter had patted the hood and said, "Someday we'll put a cabin out here, Midge, a place to retire to." But they never had the money for a cabin, and after Walter died, the land disappeared from Midge's mind the way distant relatives disappear, still technically there, but no longer part of the daily architecture of your life. The property taxes were $42 a year auto-deducted. She never noticed them. But the land was hers, and if that bus was still standing. Midge turned away from the house on Briarwood Lane and began to walk. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her now except a locked door and a woman who had already forgotten the sound of her voice. The Greyhound to Prescott cost $19. The ride took 4 hours through a landscape that changed like a slow exhalation. The suburban sprawl of Phoenix giving way to the dry hills and red rock and open sky of central Arizona. Midge sat by the window and watched the desert scroll past and did not think about Jolene or Nolan or the house on Briarwood Lane. She thought about Walter. She thought about the way he smelled after a day of working on buses, diesel fuel, and hand soap, and something underneath that was just him. She thought about his hands, which were broad and scarred, and capable of fixing anything that had moving parts. She thought about the last thing he ever said to her 3 days before the heart attack, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. "The bus still runs, Midge. Hauled it out to the property last weekend. She runs rough, but she runs." He had been talking about bus 47. She had barely listened. She was grading papers. She had said something like, "That's nice, honey," without looking up. And Walter had taken his coffee into the garage, and she had never asked him what he meant. And now she would give anything. Anything at all to go back to that kitchen and put down the red pen and look at her husband's face and ask him to tell her more. Prescott was a small city nestled among granite boulders and ponderosa pines at 5,000 feet of elevation. Midge did not stop there. She caught a local shuttle to the highway junction and then walked. Copper Hill was 12 miles east on a 2-lane road that cut through rangeland and juniper forest, and the turnoff to Walter's property was 3 miles down a dirt road that was barely a road at all, 2 ruts with grass growing between them and rocks the size of softballs embedded in the clay. She walked the 3 miles, pulling her suitcase behind her, the broken wheel dragging and catching and dragging again. The cardboard box she carried in her other arm, shifting it from left to right when her shoulder began to ache, which was every 50 yards or so. At 75, with arthritis in both knees and a hip that had been threatening to fail for 3 years, every step required a negotiation between her body and her will was winning, but only barely. She stopped 4 times to rest. She sat on her suitcase and drank water from a bottle she had bought at the Prescott gas station, and looked at the landscape around her. High desert, dry grass the color of old straw, juniper and pinon pine in twisted shapes growing out of rock, red dirt, blue sky so large it made her feel small in a way that was not unpleasant, not like the smallness Jolene had imposed on her, but the smallness of standing beneath something ancient and vast that does not care who you are, but does not wish you harm either. She saw the bus before she saw anything else. It was sitting in the middle of the 5 acres like something a giant child had abandoned. A 1972 Bluebird school bus, the yellow paint faded to the color of weak mustard rust, eating through the metal along the window frames and wheel wells. The tires were flat and cracked. Vines had grown up through the undercarriage and wrapped around the axles. The windshield was intact but opaque with dust and the residue of 15 years of desert weather. The property around the bus was worse. Overgrown with sage and tumbleweed, trash had blown in over the years. Plastic bags caught in the juniper branches like dirty flags, beer cans, a shattered plastic chair. The remnants of a campfire someone had built years ago, the stones scattered and black. Midge stood at the edge of her property and looked at what she had. And for the first time since Clement died, something happened in her chest that she did not expect. She laughed. It was not a happy sound. It was dry and cracked and tasted like dust, but it was a laugh, and it came from the same deep place where Walter's voice lived, and it meant that she was not yet finished. You could not laugh if you were finished. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the bus. The door was closed, but not locked. She had to use both hands and all her weight to pull it open, the hinges screaming in a voice that sounded like every year of neglect compressed into a single note. The interior smelled of dust and mouse droppings and the dry, papery scent of abandoned things. The seats were still there, rows of green vinyl cracked and split stuffing exposed like cotton wounds. Cobwebs hung between the seatbacks in lazy arcs. The floor was covered in leaves, dirt, the husks of dead insects, a bird's nest that had fallen from somewhere above. And there, hanging from the rearview mirror, by a piece of leather cord, was the small brass bell. Walter had hung it there years ago. She remembered now. He said it helped him know when the engine was running rough. The vibration made the bell ring differently. The bell was coated in a thick layer of dust, dull and silent. She reached up and touched it with one finger. It did not ring. It was clogged with years of grit and stillness. Midge set down her suitcase and her box. She sank into the driver's seat. The springs groaned. Through the filthy windshield, the desert stretched out in front of her, dry and vast and indifferent. The sun was going down and the sky was turning the color of bruised fruit, purple and orange, and that specific shade of red that happens only in Arizona, the red that looks like the earth is remembering something it lost a long time ago. She cried. She cried the way she had not allowed herself to cry in Jolene's house, where crying was evidence of weakness, and weakness was justification for removal. She cried for Walter, dead 15 years. She cried for Clement, gone too soon. She cried for the house on Cedar Hill Drive that she had sold because she loved her son more than she loved her own walls. She cried until her chest hurt and her eyes burned. And there was nothing left inside her except exhaustion and a strange, unexpected clarity, the clarity that comes when you have lost everything and discover you are still breathing. Then she stood up. She found an old push broom wedged behind the last row of seats. Walter must have left it. She swept the worst of the debris toward the back of the bus, working in the fading light, clearing a space near the front where she could sleep. She opened 3 windows to let the air move through. She spread her jacket across one of the less damaged seats and arranged her box of photographs beside her. She ate crackers from her bag and drank the last of her water. She had no heat, no light except the flashlight from Betty's store, no bathroom, no running water. She had a metal shell and the memory of a man who loved her, and the stubborn, unreasonable refusal to die in a way that would prove Jolene right. That first night, lying across 2 bus seats with her legs tucked up and her head on her folded coat, Midge stared at the ceiling panels and made a promise to the darkness. She would not die here, not like this, not as the punchline to the joke Jolene and Nolan were probably already telling their friends. Did you hear about Midge? Couldn't even take care of herself. Such a shame. She would survive. She did not know how. She did not have a plan. She had $47 in her checking account and a Social Security check that would arrive in 12 days and a body that ached in places she could not name. But she had something else. Something she could feel in her chest, like a pilot light that has been burning on low for years, waiting for someone to turn up the gas. "Help me, Walter," she whispered. "I don't know what I'm doing. Please help me." The desert wind moved through the open windows and stirred the dust on the brass bell. And the bell shifted slightly on its cord. And in the silence of that abandoned bus in the middle of 5 acres of Arizona, scrubland Midge heard the faintest sound. Not quite a ring, more like a whisper of metal against air. A promise that something was still there, still waiting to be heard, if only she stayed long enough to listen. She woke at dawn to the sound of a cactus wren and the ache of every joint she owned. Sleeping on bus seats at 75 was an experience she would not recommend, not that anyone was asking. She got up slowly, testing each leg before trusting it with her weight, and made her way out of the bus and behind a stand of juniper to attend to necessities with as much dignity as the desert allowed, which was not much, but more than Jolene had given her. The morning was cool and dry. The sun came up over the hills to the east in shades of amber and rose, and the light hit the bus and turned the rusted metal into something that almost looked intentional, like a sculpture someone had placed in the desert as a commentary on abandonment. Midge stood outside and breathed the air, which smelled like sage and dry earth and distance, and she noticed something she had not expected. She was not afraid. She was cold and hungry and stiff and alone, but she was not afraid. The worst thing that could happen to her had already happened. She had been thrown away by the only family she had left. Everything after that was just logistics. She walked the property, 5 acres. It took her 40 minutes with her bad knees. She found a depression in the ground where water collected a low spot near a rock outcropping that showed signs of moisture even in April. She saw rabbit tracks, quail. A roadrunner watched her from the top of a juniper and did not move when she passed beneath it. The land was not dead. It was dry and rough and unforgiving. But it was alive in the way the desert is always alive in the spaces between the obvious things in the roots that go down 30 feet, to find water in the creatures that learn to survive by needing less. Over the next days, Midge fell into a routine that was equal parts survival and stubbornness. She walked to Copper Hill every 3 days, 12 miles round trip on a dirt road. It took her most of the day. The town was barely there. A gas station, a general store with a sign that said Rose Provisions in faded red letters, a post office the size of a garden shed, a cluster of houses and mobile homes along the highway. Betty Rowe ran the general store. She was 55, built like someone who had been carrying heavy things her entire life, with calloused hands and gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense braid. The first time Midge came in dusty and limping, and clearly not a tourist, Betty watched her move through the aisles without comment. Midge bought water crackers, canned soup, a can opener. The second time Betty spoke. "You the one living out at the old Hollander place?" Midge looked at her. "I am. In the bus. In the bus." Betty considered this. She did not offer sympathy or advice or the kind of encouraging platitude that people give when they want to feel helpful without actually helping. What she said was, "You're going to need a camping stove, a 5-gallon water jug, and a tarp for that roof. Rust holes along the back end will let rain through when monsoon season hits." She helped Midge pick out supplies and rang them up at a price that was, Midge suspected, significantly lower than what was on the shelf tags. Midge did not have the pride left to argue. She said thank you and meant it. And Betty said don't mention it in a way that meant literally do not mention it to anyone ever. And that was the beginning of something Midge did not yet have a name for. 3 weeks in. The bus was cleaner now. Midge had scrubbed the seats with soap and water hauled from the spring. She had washed the windows until the light came through in actual shafts instead of a dirty glow. She had swept every day, the routine of it becoming a kind of prayer, the broom moving across the floor in the same rhythm as the rosary her mother used to say each morning. She hung a blanket across the middle of the bus for privacy, though there was no one for miles to see her. She organized her few possessions on a shelf she made from a plank and 2 stacks of canned goods. It was still a bus. It was still desperate. But it was clean, and it was hers. And there was something in that ownership that felt like the first solid ground she had stood on in 2 years. Then the storm came. She had watched the clouds build all afternoon, thick and dark over the hills to the west, the kind of clouds that meant business. Arizona storms were not like the gentle rains she remembered from Flagstaff. They were violent and brief and personal, as though the sky had a grievance it intended to settle in 30 minutes or less. The rain hit at 6 in the evening, with a sound like gravel poured on a tin roof. Thunder shook the bus on its flat tires. Lightning turned the desert white, and then dark, and then white again. Midge sat in the driver's seat and watched through the clean windshield and felt the bus shudder around her, and despite everything, despite the fear and the cold and the water that was already beginning to seep under the door, she felt a strange exhilaration. She was inside a storm. She was still here. Then she heard it, a sound beneath the thunder. Drip, drip, drip. She turned and saw the water coming through the ceiling near the back of the bus, a steady stream pouring through a rust hole she had not noticed, and it was falling directly onto the seat where she had placed her cardboard box. Her photographs, Walter, Clement, her wedding day. She scrambled. Her knees screamed. Her hip caught and she stumbled against a seat back and tore the skin on her forearm. But she kept moving, reaching for the box, pulling it toward her. Water had already soaked through the cardboard. She pulled the albums out one by one, and the third one fell open to a photograph that stopped her hands. Clement at 7, missing his front teeth, standing in the driveway on Cedar Hill Drive with a baseball glove that was too big for his hand, grinning at the camera, with the absolute confidence of a child who has never once doubted that he is loved. The photograph was wet. The image was beginning to blur at the edges, Clement's face dissolving into the paper, as though he were being erased a second time. No, Midge whispered. No, no, no. She pressed the photograph against her chest to stop the water. She could feel her heart beating against Clement's face. She looked up at the ceiling at the panel that had let the water in. It was loose, warped, clearly weakened by years of rust. She reached up and pushed at it, trying to reposition it, trying to stop the leak. The panel shifted. It moved more than she expected, sliding sideways and revealing a gap between the ceiling panels and the roof of the bus, a narrow space full of shadow and dust and something else. Lightning flashed, and in that half-second of white light, Midge saw the outline of a metal box sitting in the gap above the ceiling, wedged between two crossbeams where no metal box had any reason to be. Her heart was loud now, louder than the storm. She reached into the gap with both hands, her fingertips touching cold steel. The box was heavy, wedged tight, and she had to work it back and forth, pulling and twisting, while the rain poured through the hole and soaked her hair and ran down her face. She got it free. She pulled it down. It was a steel toolbox, the kind mechanics use, rusty but intact. The combination lock on the front had corroded into a single fused lump of metal that crumbled when she pulled at it. She carried the box to the front of the bus to the dry section near the driver's seat. She sat down. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against her knees for 10 seconds before she could open the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that Walter must have used to protect engine parts, were 3 items. A leather journal, its cover cracked, but the pages dry. A manila envelope thick with documents. And a wooden cigar box, the kind that smells like cedar, even after the cigars are gone. She opened the journal first. The handwriting was Walter's. She would have known it anywhere, that careful mechanical script he used every letter. The same height, every line straight. The handwriting of a man who spent his life making sure things were level and true. The first page. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry, Midge. I wanted to give you so much more than I did. But I leave you this hoping it helps. Hoping it's enough. Hoping you'll forgive me for not telling you sooner. She read. The journal explained in Walter's patient way that he had been a collector. Coins. For 30 years, whenever he had extra money from overtime shifts or side jobs, he bought coins. Not expensive ones, not at first. Buffalo nickels, Mercury dimes, walking Liberty halves. He kept them in the bus because he didn't trust banks and because the bus was the one place in the world that belonged only to him. Over the years, some of the coins turned out to be worth more than he had paid, much more. He had them appraised quietly without telling Midge because he wanted it to be a surprise, a retirement gift, a cabin on this land, a life after work. The last entry was dated 3 days before his heart attack. The handwriting was the same steady and level, but the words carried a weight the earlier entries did not. Midge, if something happens to me, this collection can take care of you for years. I've hidden it here because this is the safest place I know. The bus still runs in its way, and so will you. Take care of yourself. Take care of Clement. I love you always. Walter. She opened the cigar box. Inside, in individual plastic sleeves, each one labeled in Walter's handwriting, were coins. Dozens of them. She did not know their names or their values, but she could see they were old and well preserved and cared for with the same attention Walter had given to every engine he ever rebuilt. The manila envelope contained appraisal documents from a coin dealer in Prescott, dated 1 year before Walter died. The total estimated value was listed on the last page in typescript, $175,000. Midge sat in the driver's seat of the bus, while the storm raged outside and the rain found its way through the rust holes, and the wind pushed against the metal walls, and she held her dead husband's journal against her chest. In the same spot where Clement's dissolving photograph had been pressed minutes ago, and she understood something that rearranged every molecule in her body. Walter had taken care of her. 15 years after his death, lying in the ground at Greenwood Cemetery with a headstone that read, "Beloved husband and father, Walter Hollander," had reached across the distance between the living and the dead and caught her. She touched the brass bell on the rearview mirror. The storm had shaken loose the years of grit, and when her finger made contact, the bell rang. Clear and bright and unmistakable, the sound cutting through the noise of the rain, like a voice she had been waiting 15 years to hear. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Walter. The bus still runs." The morning after the storm, the desert smelled like wet sage and clean stone, and the light that came through the bus windows was sharper than any light Midge had seen in years, as though the rain had washed a layer of film off the sky and left everything underneath raw and precise. She sat in the driver's seat with the cigar box on her lap and the journal open beside her, and did not move for a long time. She was thinking. Not the scattered, panicked thinking of the past 3 weeks, the thinking of a woman trying to survive a single day, but something deeper and slower, the kind of thinking that builds structures instead of putting out fires. She had money, not in her hands, not yet, but in the box on her lap, wrapped in plastic sleeves and Walter's careful handwriting. She had $47 in her checking account and a Social Security check 12 days away, and a collection of coins that might be worth more now than the appraisal said 15 years ago. She also had a bus with holes in the roof, 5 acres of scrub desert, no running water, no electricity, and a body that was currently informing her in very specific terms that sleeping on vinyl seats and scrambling through rainstorms at 75 had consequences. Her left knee had swollen overnight to the size of a cantaloupe. The skin on her forearm where she had scraped it against the seat back was angry and red. Her lower back felt like someone had poured cement into the space between her vertebrae and let it set. But she had money, and she had a plan, or the beginning of one, which was more than she had possessed 24 hours ago. She wrapped the coins in Walter's canvas, placed the journal and the envelope on top, and put everything back in the steel toolbox. She could not leave it in the bus. The ceiling gap was compromised now, exposed by the storm. Anyone could find it. She carried the toolbox outside and buried it 3 feet deep beneath a distinctive juniper that had grown into the shape of a bent arm, marking the spot with a flat red stone. Her knees screamed during the digging. She dug anyway. Then she walked to town. The 12-mile round trip to Copper Hill was becoming familiar in the way that pain becomes familiar, not less painful but more predictable. She knew where the rocks were. She knew which sections of the road turned to mud after rain. She knew exactly how many steps she could take before she needed to stop and let her knee recover, and that number was getting smaller each week. Betty Rowe was behind the counter when Midge came in. She looked at Midge's swollen knee and torn forearm and said nothing about either. She rang up Midge's supplies and asked in the same flat tone she used for everything whether the bus had survived the storm. Mostly roof leaks. Midge hesitated. Betty's there a coin dealer in Prescott, someone reputable. Betty's eyebrows moved a quarter-inch upward, which was the Betty Rowe equivalent of visible shock. There's Aldrich Rare Coins on Cortez Street. Been there 40 years. Ed Aldrich is honest, which is more than I can say for most people who deal in things that are old and supposedly valuable. Midge thanked her and left, and Betty watched her go through the store window with an expression that might have been concern, or might have been something closer to recognition, the look of one stubborn woman observing another. Getting to Prescott required a bus ticket from the highway junction. $8. Midge counted her remaining cash 3 times before buying it. The ride took 90 minutes. Aldrich Rare Coins occupied a narrow storefront between a barber shop and a vacuum repair shop. The kind of business that has been in the same location so long, it has become part of the building's identity. Ed Aldrich was 60 thin with reading glasses that hung around his neck on a beaded chain his granddaughter had made. He looked at Midge the way all coin dealers look at walk-ins carrying paper bags, with the particular wariness of someone who has been offered a lot of worthless metal by a lot of hopeful people. Midge set 3 coins on his velvet pad. She had chosen them carefully from the collection, selecting pieces that Walter's notes identified as mid-range, in value enough to test the market without revealing the full scope of what she had. Aldrich picked up the first coin with cotton glove fingers, a 1916 D Mercury dime in what appeared to be mint condition. He held it under his loupe and went very still, the way a man goes still when he realizes the thing in front of him is not what he expected. He examined all 3 coins in silence. It took 20 minutes. When he finished, he removed his glasses and looked at Midge with an expression that had shifted from wariness to something much more attentive. Mrs. Hollander, these are exceptional pieces. The Mercury dime alone is worth 8 to 10,000 at auction. Where did you acquire them? My husband collected them over 30 years. He died in 2011. I just found them. Aldrich nodded slowly. He did not ask where she had found them or why it had taken 15 years. He was a man who understood that the stories behind coins were rarely simple and almost never his business. He offered her $22,000 for the 3 pieces, cash or cashier's check, her choice. She took the check. He also told her something Walter's appraisal had not accounted for. The coin market had moved significantly in 15 years. If the rest of the collection was comparable in quality to what she had shown him, the current value could be well over $200,000, possibly $240,000. He would be happy to do a full assessment whenever she was ready. Midge walked out of Aldrich Rare Coins with a cashier's check in her pocket, and the specific feeling of a woman who has just been told the ground beneath her feet is solid after spending 3 weeks convinced it was made of paper. She deposited the check at a bank on Gurley Street. She bought a prepaid phone at the drugstore. She bought new socks and a tube of antibiotic ointment and a proper first aid kit. She ate lunch at a diner, a turkey sandwich and a cup of coffee, and it was the first meal she had eaten sitting at a table in 25 days. She did not buy anything extravagant. She did not buy new clothes or check into a hotel or do any of the things a person might do when they suddenly have money after weeks of having nothing. She ate her sandwich and made a list on a paper napkin with a borrowed pen, and the list had 14 items on it, and every one of them was practical, and every one of them was about the bus. The work began the next day and went badly almost immediately. Midge bought materials in Prescott and paid a delivery service to haul them to the property. Lumber, roofing, sealant, screws, a handsaw, sandpaper, a basic toolkit. She had watched Walter work for 33 years of marriage. She had handed him wrenches and held flashlights and listened to him explain the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead until she could identify them by feel. She had assumed standing in the hardware store with her list that this accumulated proximity to competence would translate into actual competence. It did not. The first thing she tried to fix was the roof. She climbed a stepladder she had bought carrying a bucket of sealant and a putty knife and attempted to patch the rust holes the storm had exploited. The sealant was the wrong type for bare metal. It slid off the rust like oil on water. She applied it thicker. It slid off thicker. She spent 4 hours on the roof in 92-degree heat and accomplished nothing except a sunburn on the back of her neck and a sealant stain on her only pair of good pants that would never come out. The second thing she tried was replacing a section of rotted flooring near the back of the bus. She measured the space. She cut the lumber. The board was 2 inches too short. She cut another board, 3 inches too long. She cut a third board and it split down the center. Because she had cut against the grain, a mistake Walter would have caught in a glance, and she did not catch until the wood fell apart in her hands. She sat on the ground beside the bus surrounded by ruined lumber and dried sealant, and her own frustration. And she understood something she should have known from the beginning. Knowing how to watch someone build is not the same as knowing how to build. Being married to a mechanic for 33 years had made her an excellent observer and an incompetent carpenter. Walter's skills had died with Walter. She would have to develop her own or find another way. She found another way. 4 days later, though she did not find it so much as it found her. The sound of Midge sawing wood badly carries in desert air. Sound travels differently when there are no buildings to absorb it, no traffic to mask it, no ambient noise of civilization to soften the edges. The scrape of a dull sawed on pine carries a quarter mile without losing a decibel. And Gus Traylor heard it from his cabin on the other side of the ridge. He came on a Tuesday morning. Midge was on her knees beside the bus trying to remove a stripped screw from the door mechanism with a pair of pliers, which is roughly equivalent to trying to remove a tooth with a pair of socks. She heard boots on gravel and looked up. The man standing at the edge of her property was tall and thin and old, in the way that desert people are old, not fragile, but reduced, dried down to the essential elements like a piece of jerky. He wore a canvas jacket despite the heat, and a hat that had started its life as a fedora and evolved through decades of wear into something that no longer had a category. He carried a metal toolbox, not unlike the one Walter had hidden in the bus ceiling, and he stood at the edge of Midge's property and looked at the bus and the scattered lumber and the woman on her knees with the pliers and the stripped screw, and he did not smile, and he did not offer sympathy, and he did not introduce himself. What he said was, "That's a number 2, Phillips. You need a number 3, and pliers won't do a thing for you." Midge looked at him. The pliers were blistering her palm. "Who are you, Gus Traylor? I live over the ridge. Been hearing you saw wood for 4 days. Figured I'd come to see if the wood had done something to deserve it." Midge almost smiled. It was the first time her face had attempted that expression since Clement's funeral. "The wood is winning," she admitted. Gus set his toolbox down and opened it. He took out a screwdriver, walked to the bus door, and removed the stripped screw in 9 seconds. He did not comment on the 9 seconds. He replaced the screw with a new one from a jar in his toolbox, tightened it, and tested the door mechanism. The door swung open smoothly for the first time since Midge had arrived. Then he closed his toolbox and turned to go. "Wait," Midge said. "Do you want some water?" "I have water now." Gus looked at her for a long moment. He had eyes the color of sandstone, light brown and dry, and very, very steady. "I'm 78 years old," he said. "My wife died 6 years ago. I live in a cabin with a dog that doesn't like me and too much time on my hands. If you don't mind the company, I could come by now and then and help with the heavy lifting. My welding gear is rusting because I have nothing to weld. That bus has more rust than bus." Midge understood what he was offering and what it cost him to offer it. He was not a man who asked to be needed. He was a man who had spent 6 years alone in a cabin with a hostile dog and the sound of someone struggling to build something had pulled him out of his solitude the way a current pulls a boat from shore, not violently, but inevitably. I would appreciate that, Midge said. But I decide what gets done. This is my bus. Your bus? Gus nodded once, a single downward motion of the chin. I'm just the welder. That was the agreement. It was never discussed again. Over the next 4 months, Gus' trailer came to the property 3 or 4 days a week. He brought his welding equipment on a small trailer pulled behind his truck, an ancient Ford that ran on stubbornness and what appeared to be prayer. He welded the rust holes in the roof. He reinforced the frame where corrosion had weakened the crossbeams. He showed Midge how to measure twice and cut once, and when she measured twice and still cut wrong, he showed her how to use the mistake instead of throwing it away. Every piece of wood is the right size for something, he said. You just have to figure out what. He did not take over. When Midge asked a question, he answered it. When she did not ask, he worked on his welding and left her alone. When she made a decision about the layout or the materials or the design, he followed it even when the decision was clearly wrong, because he understood that the bus was not his project and Midge was not his student. She was a woman rebuilding her life, and the bus was the physical manifestation of that rebuilding. And if she needed to make mistakes in order to own the result, then the mistakes were part of the process. Midge learned, not quickly, not gracefully. Her hands blistered and bled and blistered again until the blisters became calluses. She hit her thumb with a hammer so many times the nail turned black and fell off and grew back crooked. She installed a shelf that fell down at 3 in the morning and shattered the only glass she owned. She connected a solar panel to the battery system backward and blew a fuse that took her 2 days to replace because she had to drive to Prescott for the part. But each failure taught her something, and each thing she learned stayed learned because she had earned it with her own bruised hands. And knowledge that costs you something is knowledge you do not forget. The bus began to change, slowly the way a face changes over years, not in any single moment, but in the accumulation of small alterations that eventually produce a different thing entirely. New floor, patched roof. The front section converted into a living area with a small kitchen, a camp stove mounted on a plywood counter, shelves for canned goods, a water jug with a gravity-fed spigot. The midsection became a sleeping area. The old seats removed and replaced with a platform bed Midge built from pallet wood that Gus helped her plane smooth. The back section remained storage. The day the solar panel finally worked, the day Midge flipped the switch, and a single LED bulb mounted above the driver's seat came on and stayed on. She stood in the bus and looked at that light for 5 minutes without speaking. It was a small bulb, 20 watts. It illuminated a circle no larger than a dinner table. But it was light she had made, light she had earned through 6 days of reading YouTube tutorials on a cracked phone screen and 2 blown fuses and a 3-hour argument with a charge controller that turned out to be installed upside down. Gus was welding a grab bar by the door. He looked up at the light and then at Midge and said the first personal thing he had said in 3 months of working beside her. My wife would have liked you. That was all. He went back to welding. Midge went back to work. But something had shifted between them. Some membrane of formality dissolving, and from that day forward, the silences they shared while working were not the silence of strangers, but the silence of people who have decided they can trust each other with the absence of words. Betty Rowe started talking, not deliberately, not with any promotional intent, but in the way that people in small towns talk, which is constantly and about everything. She mentioned to customers that the woman out on the old Hollander property was converting a school bus into a house by hand. She mentioned it to the mail carrier and the gas station attendant, and the woman who came in every Thursday for dog food. The story spread the way stories spread in places with 300 residents completely and within a week. People began to drive by, slowly, the way you drive past a car accident or a particularly good sunset, with that combination of curiosity and something harder to name. Midge would look up from her work and see a truck idling on the dirt road, a face in the window watching. Some of them waved, most of them just looked. Then Dorothy Phelps showed up. Dorothy was 70, recently divorced after 41 years living in a rental apartment in Prescott, and spending most of her time trying to remember who she was before she became someone's wife. She had read a blog post about the bus lady of Copper Hill, written by a sustainability blogger who had driven out to photograph the property. She drove 40 miles on a Saturday morning to see for herself. Midge was on the roof caulking a seam when Dorothy's car pulled up. She climbed down slowly, her hip protesting, and found a woman standing beside a Buick with tears on her face.
Dorothy's voice was steady despite the tears. I read about you. I had to come. I just needed to see that it was real, that a woman our age could actually do something like this. Because right now, I can't even figure out how to pay my electric bill. And I keep thinking my life is over, and everyone keeps telling me I should be grateful for what I have. And what I have is a one-bedroom apartment and a cat that hates me, and a daughter who calls once a month out of guilt.
Midge did not say anything inspirational. She did not offer wisdom or perspective or the kind of motivational language that sounds good on a poster and means nothing in a kitchen at midnight. She said, "Do you drink coffee?" I just figured out how to make coffee on a camp stove without burning it. It took me 3 weeks. Dorothy laughed. The laugh broke something open in both of them, the way laughs do when they arrive in places where crying would be easier and less honest. They drank coffee in the bus, sitting in the 2 chairs Midge had salvaged from a thrift store in Prescott, and Dorothy told her story, and Midge listened. After Dorothy left 3 hours later, Midge sat alone in the bus and realized something had happened that she had not planned for and did not fully understand. She had helped someone, not with money, not with labor, not with any of the practical things she had been focused on for weeks. She had helped someone simply by being a woman who had been thrown away and had refused to stay thrown. More women came. Martha, 72, whose children had sold her house while she was in the hospital for a hip replacement. Joan, 68, whose husband had cleaned out their bank account and moved to Florida with his dental hygienist. Each woman arrived with a different story and the same expression, the look of someone who has been told they are finished and has almost started to believe it. Midge did not start a group. She did not make plans or set schedules or give her gathering a name. She just made coffee and listened and shared what she had learned, which was not much, but was enough. How to survive on very little. How to ask for help without feeling like you are surrendering. How to wake up in a place that is not what you wanted and find one thing about it that is worth staying for. The weekly gatherings around the fire pit began simply. 3 women, then 5, then sometimes 8 or 9 sitting in mismatched chairs as the sun went down over the desert, drinking coffee or tea, talking or not talking. Being together in a way that required nothing except presence. Then Russ Kendrick's white SUV appeared on the dirt road, and the quiet life Midge had been assembling one careful piece at a time began to shake. Kendrick was 50 from Phoenix, with the tanned confidence of a man who had spent his career turning empty land into profitable land. He wore pressed khakis and a polo shirt, and sunglasses that cost more than Midge's entire wardrobe. He was polite in the way that people are polite when they believe politeness is a tool rather than a habit, a thing you deploy strategically and withdraw when it stops producing results. "Mrs. Hollander," he said, stepping out of his vehicle and extending a hand Midge did not take. "I represent Kendrick Development Group. We're planning a wellness resort in this area. Spa, hiking trails, meditation retreats. Very high-end. Your property sits right in the middle of our planned development. I'd like to make you an offer." Midge wiped her hands on her jeans. She had been digging a trench for a waterline from the spring. "She's done the math, Walter. $50,000 for your 5 acres. She looked at him and felt nothing except a mild irritation at being interrupted. "This land isn't for sale." Kendrick smiled. "Everyone says that at first. Let me leave my card. Think it over. 50,000 is very generous for undeveloped scrubland with no utilities." He left his card on the bus steps. Midge used it to level a wobbly table leg. He came back a week later with a revised offer. 70,000. Midge said no. He came back 4 days after that. 80,000 and we'll cover all your relocation costs. Midge said, I am not relocating. My husband left me this land. I'm keeping it. Something in Kendrick's face changed on the third visit. The politeness was still there, but the thing underneath it was showing through. Now the way rebar shows through concrete when the surface starts to crack. He looked at the bus at the garden Midge had started along the south side at the fire pit, and the mismatched chairs. Mrs. Hollander, this property is zoned agricultural. A converted school bus is not a recognized dwelling under county code. If I were to file a complaint, the county would have to send an inspector, and an inspector would find code violations, many of them. He left without waiting for a response. 12 days later, a notice from the county zoning office arrived in Midge's P.O. box in Copper Hill. Complaint filed, inspection scheduled. Potential violations: unauthorized dwelling, substandard sanitation, unpermitted electrical installation. Penalty for non-compliance: removal of structure. Midge sat in the bus with the notice in her hands and felt the ground shift beneath her. Not the literal ground, which was Arizona granite, and not going anywhere but the figurative ground. The sense of safety she had been building, one solar panel and one shelf and one cup of coffee at a time. Francine Hale's name came from Betty, who said it the way she said everything, flatly and without elaboration. Francine Hale lives on Juniper Road, used to practice land use law in Phoenix before she retired out here. She might know something useful. Francine was 70 small, with white hair cut short and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the particular energy of a woman who had spent 40 years arguing in courtrooms and had not yet entirely stopped. She read the county notice at her kitchen table, while Midge sat across from her drinking water from a glass that had a chip in the rim. This is a nuisance complaint, Francine said, filed by a third party with financial interest in the outcome. The county has to investigate because a complaint was filed, but the complaint itself is flimsy. She looked up. How long has your family owned this land? Since the 1930s. My husband's uncle homesteaded it. Francine's mouth did something that was almost a smile. Then the structure has grandfathered status, pre-existing non-conforming use. The zoning changes that Kendrick is relying on were enacted in 1987. Your bus was placed on the property before that. County can't force removal of a structure that predated the current code. She made 3 phone calls. The first to the county zoning office, where she spoke to someone named Harold, in a voice that combined professional courtesy with the unmistakable implication that Harold's life would become complicated if this matter was not handled correctly. The second to a surveyor who could confirm the placement date of the bus from aerial photographs. The third to Russ Kendrick's office, where she left a message that consisted of 14 words, 8 of which were legal terminology, and all of which Midge gathered from context meant back off. The county inspection came and went. The inspector, a young man who looked uncomfortable from the moment he stepped out of his truck, found several minor violations. The electrical system needed a proper ground. The composting toilet required a setback certificate, but confirmed that the structure qualified for non-conforming use protection. Kendrick's complaint was dismissed. Midge celebrated by finishing the water line from the spring. It took her 3 days and 2 trips to the hardware store, and 1 episode of lying on her back in a trench while Gus stood above her and told her the fitting was backward, which it was. But when she turned the spigot at the kitchen counter, and water came out, actual running water, cold and clear, and slightly mineral tasting. She stood there with her hand under the stream and felt something she had not felt since Walter was alive. Competence. Not perfection, not mastery. Just the simple, profound satisfaction of having made something work with her own labor and her own stubborn refusal to accept that she could not. But Kendrick was not the kind of man who accepted a no from a county office and moved on. He operated on a different principle, the principle that obstacles are just problems that haven't been properly funded. Within a month of the complaint's dismissal, Midge noticed changes. The dirt road to her property, which was the only vehicle access, began to deteriorate. Roots deepened. Rocks appeared in the road where there had been none, sharp rocks, the kind that puncture tires. A gate appeared at the head of the road with a sign, "Private property, no trespassing." Kendrick had bought the 40-acre parcel between Midge's land and the county road. The dirt road crossed his property, and he was claiming it was a private road, which meant he could close it, which meant Midge was trapped. No vehicle access, no way for deliveries, no way for the women who came every week to reach her, no way for the ambulance she might need if her blood pressure, which the free clinic in Prescott had told her was dangerously high, decided to stop being patient with her. Francine reviewed the situation and did not sugarcoat it. "If he's right about the road being private, you're landlocked. I can file for an easement, but that takes months, and in the meantime, he can legally restrict access." Midge felt the walls closing. Not the metal walls of the bus, which he had learned to love, but the invisible walls that money builds around people who don't have enough of it. Kendrick had more lawyers than she had dollars. He could wait. She could not. Then on a Wednesday morning in early October, Midge was alone in the bus cleaning the windows when the floor tilted. Not the bus was on blocks and hadn't moved in 15 years. The floor inside her head tilted, the horizon swinging sideways, the light going strange and flat. She reached for the counter and missed it. She reached for the wall and her hand went through the air where the wall should have been. She felt her knees give way, felt the floor come up to meet her, felt the side of her head hit the platform bed frame, and then she felt nothing at all. Gus found her 40 minutes later. He had come to drop off a piece of welded railing and found the bus door open and Midge on the floor with blood in her hair and a pulse that was fast and thin and wrong. He drove her to the hospital in Prescott in his truck, 20 miles over the speed limit on a road full of the rocks Kendrick's people had placed there. His old Ford bouncing and grinding, Midge unconscious in the passenger seat, with his jacket pressed against the cut on her head. The emergency room doctor was young and direct. Hypertensive crisis. Blood pressure 210 over 130. Moderate dehydration. Anemia. The cut on her head required 4 stitches. She had also, the doctor noted with the careful understatement of someone trying not to frighten an elderly patient, experienced a transient ischemic attack. A mini stroke. The kind of event that was both a warning and a preview. "Mrs. Hollander, you cannot continue living the way you've been living. The physical labor, the stress, the inadequate nutrition. Your body is telling you it has reached its limit. If you don't listen, the next event may not be transient." Midge lay in the hospital bed with an IV in her arm and a monitor beeping the rhythm of her heart. And she stared at the ceiling tiles and thought, this is how it ends. Not with Jolene's cruelty or Kendrick's lawyers or the desert heat. It ends here in a hospital bed because my body decided I had asked too much of it. And my body was right. She thought about the bus sitting empty on the property. She thought about the brass bell hanging from the rearview mirror. She thought about Walter's journal and the coin still buried under the juniper tree and the garden she had planted along the south wall that was just beginning to produce tomatoes. She thought about Dorothy and Martha and Joan and the other women who came on Wednesdays to sit around the fire pit and remind each other they were not invisible. She thought about Gus, who had carried her to his truck without speaking and driven 20 miles with his hands shaking on the wheel. And she thought with a clarity that felt like ice water in her chest about Jolene, about the door closing, about the deadbolt turning, about standing on the sidewalk with a suitcase and a box while the sprinkler went tsk across the street. She thought about Jolene saying, "You'll die alone in that bus." The ceiling tiles blurred. Midge closed her eyes. She was released 3 days later with a bag of medications and a list of restrictions and the doctor's explicit instruction to stop lifting anything heavier than a bag of groceries. She called Gus from the hospital lobby and he came to pick her up, and neither of them spoke on the drive back. and the silence between them was not comfortable but necessary. The silence of two people who both understood that something had changed, and neither knew yet what it meant. Gus pulled up to the property and stopped the truck, and Midge looked through the windshield and her breath left her body. There were cars on the road. 7 of them parked along the shoulders, and the gate Kendrick had installed was open, the chain hanging loose, and on the property, on her property, there were people. 8 women and 2 men she had never seen before, and Betty Rowe and Dorothy and Martha and Joan, and they were working. 2 women were painting the south wall of the bus. A man was on a ladder, replacing a section of roof flashing. Betty was unloading bags of groceries from her truck. Dorothy was on her knees in the garden weeding. Martha was hanging laundry on a line that had not existed 3 days ago. Gus put the truck in park. He looked at Midge. She was gripping the dashboard with both hands, and her face was doing something complicated that involved every muscle at once. Dorothy saw the truck and stood up and walked toward it and opened the passenger door and looked at Midge with dirt on her knees and resolution in her eyes, and her voice was quiet and firm and did not wobble. "You built this, Midge. We are just finishing what you started. Now get out of the truck and come sit down and tell us if we are painting the right color. Because Betty picked the blue and Joan picked the green, and if someone doesn't settle this in the next 10 minutes, I cannot be held responsible." Midge got out of the truck. She stood on her land in the October sun, surrounded by women who had showed up because showing up was the thing they knew how to do, and she did not cry, not exactly. But something moved through her that was larger than crying. Something that had no name but felt like the brass bell ringing. Then Gus's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. His face went flat. He walked to Midge and held the phone where she could see it. It was a text from Betty's husband forwarded from the Copper Hill Community Board. Kendrick Development Group had filed an emergency motion with the county. The motion cited Midge's hospitalization as evidence that the property was being used as an unsafe dwelling by a medically compromised individual, and requested immediate condemnation of the structure and mandatory evacuation of the occupant on grounds of imminent danger to health and safety. The hearing was scheduled for Monday, 5 days away, and if Kendrick won, the county would have the authority to remove not just Midge, but the bus itself, tear it down, clear the property, and condemn the land as unfit for habitation. Midge read the text twice. She looked at the women painting her bus and weeding her garden and arguing about paint colors. She looked at the desert stretching out around her, vast and indifferent and beautiful. She looked at the bus that still ran, the bus that Walter had saved, and she had rebuilt, and her body had nearly died trying to keep. 5 days. She had 5 days to save everything. Francine Hale arrived at the property that same evening with a legal pad, a box of file folders, and the specific energy of a woman who had been waiting for a fight worth having. She sat at the fire pit with Midge and Gus and read the emergency motion twice, the second time aloud, stopping at certain phrases to underline them with a pencil that she held the way a surgeon holds a scalpel. "Imminent danger to health and safety," Francine repeated. "That's their argument. They're using your hospital stay as a weapon, claiming you're a vulnerable adult living in an unsafe structure." Midge's hands were folded in her lap. Her head still ached where the stitches pulled. Can they win? Francine set the legal pad down. If this were just about zoning, no. We already beat them on that. But a health and safety condemnation is a different animal. It goes before a different judge. And Kendrick's lawyers will argue that a 75-year-old woman who collapsed alone in a bus and needed emergency hospitalization is proof that the living situation is medically untenable. So my body betrayed me, and now they'll use it to take my home. Francine looked at her steadily. Your body did what 75-year-old bodies do when they're pushed too hard. That's not betrayal. That's biology. The question is whether we can demonstrate to a judge that this property is a viable, safe dwelling with adequate community support, and that the condemnation request is a pretext for a commercial land grab. She paused. can we? The 5 days before the hearing were the most focused days of Midge's life, and she spent most of them sitting down, which was both the doctor's orders and an exercise in trust she had never attempted. The women came. Not just the regulars, not just Dorothy and Martha and Joan, but women. Midge had never met friends of friends' women from the Prescott Senior Center who had heard the story, women from a church group in Chino Valley who showed up in a van with cleaning supplies, and a certified electrician named Hank who donated his Saturday to bringing the bus wiring up to code. Midge sat in the driver's seat and watched through the windshield as her property was transformed by hands that were not hers. The electrical system was grounded properly and inspected. The composing toilet received its setback certification. A smoke detector was installed. A first aid kit was mounted on the wall. The grab bars Gus had welded were checked and tightened. The water filtration system was tested and documented. Every improvement was photographed. Every photograph was time-stamped. Francine was building a case, and the case was made of evidence that this bus was not a hazard, but a home maintained by a community that had chosen to maintain it. Betty Rowe did something nobody expected. She drove to the county assessor's office and pulled the property records for every parcel Kendrick had purchased in the Copper Hill area. She spread them on the counter of her store and found what Francine had suspected, but could not prove Kendrick had bought 7 parcels in the previous 18 months, all surrounding Midge's land, all purchased through shell companies with different names. He had been planning this acquisition long before he knocked on Midge's door. Her refusal to sell was not an inconvenience. It was the only obstacle between Kendrick and a contiguous 200-acre development site. But Betty found something else in those records, something that changed everything. The dirt road to Midge's property, the road Kendrick had gated and claimed as private. Betty traced its history through 4 decades of county maps and found a survey from 1952 filed by the Yavapai County Road Department, designating the road as a county maintenance easement. It had never been vacated. It had never been transferred. It was, and had always been, a public road. Kendrick's gate was illegal. His claim of private access was false, and the documents proving it had been sitting in the county assessor's filing cabinet for 74 years. Francine received this information on Saturday afternoon, and her smile, the first genuine smile Midge had seen on her face, was the smile of a woman holding a winning hand and knowing exactly when to play it. Monday morning, Prescott Municipal Courtroom, 3B. Midge wore the same jeans and blue sweater she had been wearing when Jolene threw her out because they were the best clothes she owned, and because there was a certain justice in wearing to court the same outfit she had been discarded in. Francine wore a gray suit that looked like it had been waiting in her closet for exactly this occasion. Kendrick's legal team consisted of 2 young attorneys from Phoenix in expensive shoes. They presented their case efficiently, medical records from Midge's hospitalization photographs of the bus taken before the community improvements testimony from a hired expert on elderly safety standards. Their argument was clean and simple. An elderly woman living alone in a converted vehicle with a documented medical emergency. The county had a duty to intervene. Francine let them finish. She did not interrupt. She did not object. She sat beside Midge and took notes and waited with the patience of someone who has spent 40 years learning that the most powerful thing a lawyer can do is let the other side talk long enough to build a house she can dismantle with a single question. When it was her turn, Francine did not begin with the easement. She began with Midge. She called no expert witnesses. She called Dorothy Phelps, who told the judge she had been visiting the property weekly for 4 months and had never observed an unsafe condition. She called Gus Traylor, who described the structural reinforcements he had made and produced welding certifications from his years at the Prescott shipyard that no one in the courtroom had known existed. She called Betty Rowe, who testified in her flat, unadorned way that the Hollander property was better maintained than half the occupied dwellings in Copper Hill, several of which she named to the visible discomfort of a county official in the second row. Then Francine introduced the 1952 survey. She projected it on the courtroom screen. She pointed to the easement designation. She showed the current county map, which still reflected the easement. She showed the title records of Kendrick's purchase, which made no mention of an existing easement because Kendrick's title company had either missed it or chosen not to look. Your Honor, this emergency motion is not about Mrs. Hollander's health. It is about Mr. Kendrick's investment. He has spent 18 months acquiring land around her property for a commercial development. The only parcel he cannot acquire is hers because she will not sell. The gate he installed on the county easement road is illegal. The complaint he filed was pretextual, and the medical emergency he is citing as grounds for condemnation was caused in part by the stress of defending herself against his repeated attempts to force her off her own land. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and an expression that suggested she had heard every possible variation of powerful people trying to take things from less powerful people, looked at Kendrick's attorneys. She asked if they had been aware of the 1952 easement. They had not. She asked if their client had been aware. They could not say. She asked if the gate would be removed voluntarily or if she would need to issue an order. They said they would consult with their client. Remove it by Friday, the judge said. Her voice was conversational. The motion for condemnation is denied. The complaint is dismissed with prejudice. And counsel, please advise your client that filing pretextual motions to harass elderly property owners is the kind of practice that attracts the attention of the state bar. We are adjourned. Midge sat in the courtroom for a full minute after everyone else had stood. Francine touched her shoulder. It's over, Midge. It wasn't over. It was something else. It was the feeling of having been pushed to the edge of a cliff and discovering at the last moment that the ground was solid after all, that it had always been solid, and that the only thing threatening to push her off was a man with money and a woman with a clipboard. And neither of them had the authority to move her from a place that was hers. She stood up. Her knees did not buckle. Her hip did not protest. She walked out of the courtroom and into the Prescott sunshine and found the parking lot full of people she recognized. Betty, Dorothy, Martha, Joan. Gus leaning against his truck with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low. Hank the electrician. 6 women from the Wednesday gatherings. They had driven 40 miles to sit in the gallery, and they were standing in the parking lot now waiting. And when Midge came through the door, they did not cheer or applaud because that was not who they were. Dorothy nodded once. Betty said, "Well then." Gus opened the truck door. They drove home. 3 weeks later, Russ Kendrick's white SUV appeared on the dirt road one final time. The gate was gone. The road was clear. He pulled up to the property and got out and stood looking at the bus and the garden and the solar panels and the fire pit, where 3 women were sitting with mugs of tea, and something in his posture was different. Looser, less composed, like a man who has been carrying a heavy thing and has decided to set it down. Midge walked over to him. She did not invite him to sit. She did not offer tea. Kendrick looked at her for a long moment. He did not apologize. Men like Kendrick did not apologize. But he said something she had not expected. I've been doing this for 25 years. Buying land, building projects, moving people along. You're the first person who didn't move. Midge's voice was even. I'm not tough, Mr. Kendrick. I'm just still here. He looked at the bus one more time. He got in his SUV and drove away, and Midge never saw him again. She learned later from Betty that Kendrick had shifted his development to a site 15 miles north away from Copper Hill, away from the 5 acres where a brass bell hung from a rearview mirror and rang when the wind came through the valley. The seasons turned, summer, fall, another winter milder than the first, because the bus had insulation now and a small wood stove Gus had installed, and a draft system Midge had designed herself after 3 failed attempts and 1 singed eyebrow. Spring came again, and with it the garden exploded in a way that desert gardens do when they finally have water, and attention tomatoes and peppers and squash and sunflowers that grew 6 feet tall along the south wall of the bus. and turned their faces toward the light every morning, like congregants at the church service. The Wednesday gatherings had become something larger than Midge intended. Women came from Prescott, from Chino Valley, from as far as Sedona. Some came once and never returned. Some came every week for months. Some came in crisis and left steadier. One woman, Patricia, arrived in January with a garbage bag full of clothes and nowhere to sleep. And Midge gave her the small cabin that Gus and 3 volunteers had built at the far corner of the property, using lumber from a demolished barn. Patricia stayed for 6 weeks and then moved to an apartment in Prescott and got a job at the library and called Midge every Sunday evening to report on her week, and the calls always ended the same way. Thank you for not letting me disappear. Then on a Tuesday evening in March, nearly 2 years after Jolene had closed the front door on Briarwood Lane, Midge's phone rang. The voice on the other end was smaller than she remembered, quieter, scraped down to something that sounded almost like honesty. "Lisa, Midge, it's Jolene." Midge sat down. She was in the driver's seat, her favorite place where the windshield framed the desert and the setting sun and the garden along the south wall. The brass bell hung above her, catching the last of the light. Jolene spoke quickly, the way people speak when they are afraid that if they stop, they will not be able to start again. "Nolan and I are divorced. The house was foreclosed. I'm in a studio apartment. I'm working 2 jobs. I'm not calling to ask for anything. I just needed to tell you that I know what I did. I know how wrong it was. I've had 2 years to sit with it, and there's nothing I can tell myself that makes it okay. You gave us everything. I threw you away. There's no version of that story where I'm not the villain." Midge listened. She did not interrupt. She had learned over 2 years of Wednesday gatherings that the most important thing you can do for a person who is trying to say something true is to let them finish. "I saw the articles," Jolene continued, "about the property, about the women you help. Clement would have been so proud of you. I know I don't have the right to say that, but I am too proud of you." The sun was going down. The sky was doing the thing it did in Arizona, turning colors that did not exist anywhere else on Earth. Reds and oranges and a deep violet that settled over the desert like a bruise healing in reverse. "Thank you," Midge said. She meant it. Not because the words fixed anything. Not because forgiveness is a switch you can flip with a single phone call after 2 years of silence. But because the words were real, and Midge had spent enough time around broken women to know the difference between a performance and a reckoning. And what she heard in Jolene's voice was a woman standing in the wreckage of her own choices and finally looking at what she had done without flinching. They talked for 10 more minutes. Jolene did not ask for money. She did not hint. She did not angle for an invitation or a second chance or any of the things Midge had spent the first year preparing herself to refuse. She just apologized and asked how the garden was doing and said goodbye. Midge sat in the driver's seat for a long time after the call ended. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. She felt something more complicated and more honest than either of those things. A sadness so clean it was almost peaceful. The sadness of knowing that some damage cannot be undone, but that the people who caused it are not frozen in the moment of causing it. That they move forward too, that they carry it too, that the weight is not hers alone. At the Wednesday gathering that week, sitting around the fire pit with 11 women, and Gus, who always sat slightly apart because he said fire pits were for talking, and he was better at listening, Midge told them about the call. "I used to think," she said, slowly choosing each word with the same care she had learned to use when measuring lumber, "that the people who hurt us owe us something. An explanation. An apology. A reason that makes it make sense. And maybe they do. But waiting for that debt to be paid is its own kind of prison." Jolene called. She apologized. It was real. And I could feel the weight of expecting that call lift off me, and I hadn't even known I was carrying it. Dorothy asked the question Midge knew someone would ask. Would you help her? If she asked Midge, watch the fire. The juniper wood popped and sent a column of sparks into the darkening sky. I don't know, maybe, on my terms. with the understanding that helping someone is not the same as going back to what was. She paused, but she didn't ask. She just apologized. And that right now is enough. The fire burned down to coals. The women drifted to their cars in ones and twos, headlights tracing the dirt road as they drove toward the highway. Gus was the last to leave. He stood by his truck and looked at the sky, which was full of stars in the way that only desert skies are full of stars, not scattered, but packed, dense, layered, as though someone had spilled a lifetime of small bright things and never bothered to pick them up. "Good night, Midge. Good night, Gus." He drove away. The tail lights of his truck disappeared over the ridge. Midge stood alone on her property in the dark. 5 acres, 1 bus, a garden, a cabin, a fire pit with warm stones. The smell of juniper smoke and sage, and the dry mineral scent of desert rock cooling after a long day of holding heat. She walked to the bus and climbed the steps. The interior glowed faintly from the solar-powered light above the kitchen counter. 20 watts, the same bulb she had celebrated months ago when the panel first worked. The wood stove ticked as the last embers settled. The bed was made. The shelves were full. Walter's journal sat on the small table beside the driver's seat, its leather cover worn smooth by her hands. She sat in the driver's seat. She always ended the day here. It was the place where she had first cried, and the place where she had first laughed, and the place where she had found Walter's coins, and the place where she made every decision that mattered. The windshield framed the night sky. The brass bell hung from the rearview mirror, polished now free of dust, catching the faint light from the kitchen and holding it in its curved surface like a small contained sun. A breeze came through the cracked window. The bell moved. It rang. One clear note that hung in the air the way certain moments hang in a life, not fading so much as settling, becoming part of the architecture of the silence that follows. Midge touched the bell with one finger. She remembered the night she arrived, how the bell had been clogged with grit and years of stillness, how it had made no sound when she reached for it. She remembered the storm, the faint whisper of metal that she had taken as a sign, and that was probably just wind, but that she chose to believe was something more. She remembered the day the solar panel worked, when Gus had looked at the light and said his wife would have liked her. And the bell had rung then too, though no one had touched it and the windows were closed. The bus had carried children to school for 20 years. Small bodies in those green vinyl seats, backpacks and lunch boxes, and the noise of 30 voices talking at once. It had carried them to the place where they would learn to read and add and raise their hands and become whoever they were going to become. And then the bus had been retired, and Walter had towed it to this land, and it had sat here for 15 years waiting, not rusting, waiting. Because some vehicles are not finished when the engine stops. Some vehicles carry people to where they need to go long after the wheels stop turning. The bus still runs, Walter had said, and he had been right. Not about the engine, about what the bus was for, about what it could still do if someone was willing to sit in the driver's seat and choose a destination. Midge leaned back. The seat springs that had groaned under her weight on the first night now held her steadily, the way familiar things do when you have lived with them long enough to wear them into the shape of your body. She closed her eyes. The bell rang again faintly as the breeze passed through, and the sound was not a goodbye, and not a hello, but something in between, the sound of a thing that has been waiting a long time to be heard by the right person in the right silence. Outside, the desert stretched in every direction, vast and dark and alive with the small sounds of things that survive by being patient. Inside the bus, Midge Hollander breathed. She was 76 years old. She was healthy enough. She was not alone. She had a home she had built with her own blistered hands, and a community that had built itself around her, and a bell that rang when the wind remembered, and a man who loved her buried in the ground 400 miles away, and still taking care of her. Tomorrow she would work in the garden. She would host the Wednesday gathering. She would drink coffee with Dorothy and argue with Gus about the proper way to sharpen a saw blade and walk her 5 acres and check the water line and sit in the driver's seat at sunset and listen for the bell. The bus still runs. If someone in your life is starting over right now, if someone you love has been told they are too old or too broken or too far gone to rebuild, share this story with them. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you had to begin again at 75? What would you carry with you, and what would you finally set down?